very, very warm welcome to the second in our Sir Martin Gilbert Churchill Conversations series. I am Shirley Gilbert. I'm Professor of Modern Jewish History at University College London and also the Academic Director of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre. And we are really delighted to be hosting this series in partnership with the International Churchill Society and the Churchill Archives Centre. The Conversations are a series of virtual events which discuss new scholarship and perspectives on the life and legacy of Sir Winston Churchill, and we decided to present them in honor of the late historian Sir Martin Gilbert, who was, of course, Winston Churchill's official biographer, who over the course of 20 years between 1968 and 1988 completed the final 6 of 8 volumes of Churchill's life. Sir Martin also compiled and edited a series of documents known as the Companion Volumes, 17 further Churchill-related books, as well as several dozen more influential and widely read accounts of the 20th century, the First and Second World Wars, the Holocaust, Israel, and the modern Jewish experience. Sir Martin was not only a master chronicler of the modern world, but also had a remarkable ability to bring history alive to his audiences. So it's fitting that the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre, which was recently established in his memory, has the aim of bringing the finest historical research to a broad non-academic public and making that history accessible and exciting. And it's really in that spirit that we offer a wide program of events across the year on the subjects Sir Martin spent his life exploring. So please do join our mailing list. Justin will put a link for us in the chat so that we can let you know about our forthcoming events. I also want to extend a very special welcome today to Sir Martin's widow, Lady Esther Gilbert, who unfortunately you won't be able to see because you can only see us panelists, but is with us today. So welcome, Esther. It's really great to have you here. Today, the subject of our conversation is Churchill's daughters, and we are delighted to have with us Emma Soames, Rachel Trethewey, and Catherine Grace Katz to engage first in discussion with one another and then with you, our audience. So their presentations and discussion will take about 40 to 45 minutes, and after that, we'll open up to all of you for questions. You can submit questions through the Q&A function, and please feel free to do that throughout the chat, and we will be monitoring those. As we did at our last session a couple of weeks ago, we will be giving away 2 books, one copy of Rachel's book, The Churchill Girls, and one copy of Catherine's book, The Daughters of Yalta, for the 2 best questions we receive from you. And I will hand over now to Alan Packwood, who is the director of the Churchill Archives Centre, to introduce our speakers. Go ahead, Alan.
Thank you very much, Shirley. And good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. We could have called this talk The Puppy Kitten, the Mule and Maria, because those were the nicknames given by Winston and Clementine Churchill to their 3 daughters, Diana, Sarah and Mary. And we should also remember Marigold, the other Churchill daughter who tragically died in infancy in 1921. Her nickname was the Duckadilly. And those nicknames, I think, remind us that this was a family, and like all families, had its own complex web of personal relationships, emotions, issues, and characters. The difference being that it was a family in the political spotlight. The 3 Churchill girls were, as we will hear, 3 very different individuals and characters, and they all had to cope with being the child of one of the most famous men in the world. And they did so in different ways, with varying levels of success at different times. But all 3 were very much part of Churchill's inner circle, and all 3 wore uniform during the Second World War, with Sarah and Mary accompanying their father on some of his key wartime travels and adventures. As Sarah put it, they were threads in the tapestry, but vital ones that helped hold the whole picture together. So I'm delighted that we're able to explore their role further in the company of our 3 expert speakers who all have new or newish books on this subject. Rachel Trethewey was born and schooled in Devon and educated at Oxford, where she read history. Like Churchill, she combined this with a love of journalism and has had a highly successful career as both a journalist and a writer of popular history. Her previous works include A Passionate History or Passionate Life of Georgina, Duchess of Bedford, The Story of the Red Cross Pearls, and an account of the other women in the life of Edward VIII before Wallis Simpson. But she's joining us today because she has just written the excellent The Churchill Girls, a comparative biography of the lives of Diana, Sarah, and Mary. Catherine Grace Katz is joining us from Chicago. She has a BA in history from Harvard, a master's degree from the University of Cambridge, and is currently pursuing her Doctor of Jurisprudence degree at Harvard Law School. And yet somehow, and I really don't know how, somehow while doing all of that, she has also found the time to write a riveting account of the Yalta Conference, which highlights the roles and the perspectives of the key women who were present: Sarah Churchill, Anna Roosevelt, and Kathleen Harriman. And the Wall Street Journal described Catherine's book, The Daughters of Yalta, as skillfully written and meticulously researched, and as an extraordinary work that reveals the human side underlying the politics, which is, of course, exactly what we want this evening. Emma Soames is the granddaughter of Sir Winston Churchill, and so brings her first-hand knowledge of all of the three Churchill daughters to this talk. She inherited, I think, through her mother, her grandfather's literary prowess and literary genes, and she has been an editor of the Literary Review, of Tatler, ES Magazine, the Telegraph Magazine, and Saga Magazine. Emma is currently working with the Churchill Archive Centre, and particularly with my colleague Catherine Thompson, on an edited version of the wartime diaries of her mother, Mary Churchill, later the Lady Soames. And this fascinating resource promises, I think, to provide real and fresh insights into the family relationships and the important role that not just Mary, but that all three sisters played. So let's get going. As you heard from Shirley, each speaker is going to present for about 10 minutes, and then we will go into Q&A afterwards. We're aiming to finish sometime around 6:15, and I'm quite certain that there are going to be lots of questions. In fact, I think I can already see them sort of starting to pile up. So if you want to make sure that your question is asked, get it in early, post it into the Q&A function now. And as you heard from Shirley, as an added incentive, we're going to be giving away a copy of both Catherine and Rachel's books to those two individuals we deem to have asked the best questions this evening, and Shirley will announce those at the end. So let's get straight into it, and perhaps Rachel, we can start with you.
Thank you very much, Alan. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm delighted to be talking to you about Winston's daughters. I first came across the Churchill girls when I was researching another project in the Churchill archives. I found a letter from Sarah Churchill to Winston, which was so intimate and informal, it made me want to know more about the woman who wrote it and her relationship with her father. In the letter, she discussed her attitudes to love, marriage, and children in such a relaxed way that it shed new light on the great statesman for me, showing him as an approachable parent. I was also impressed by the woman who wrote it. She came across as a sensitive, passionate person who was juggling the demands of caring for her loved ones whilst being true to herself. Since reading that letter, I've got to know the stories of all four of Winston's daughters well. Researching them, there was never a dull moment. Their lives were full of drama, romance, and unfortunately, tragedy. Sadly, the Churchills' third daughter, Marigold, died before she had time to fulfill her potential. She was a radiant little girl who filled her parents' lives with fun and laughter. But while on holiday with her siblings at Broadstairs, she caught a cold and sore throat, which developed into septicemia. In the era before antibiotics, there was nothing that could be done to save her. Winston and Clementine rushed to be with her, but she died shortly afterwards, before her third birthday. Her three surviving sisters were all very different women from each other and led very varied lives. Born in 1909, Diana was Winston and Clementine's first child. She grew up to be a shy and sensitive young woman. Her relationship with her mother was complicated. She believed that she did not live up to Clementine's exacting standards, but she was always very close to Winston. Before she was married, she was described as his special chum, and she was very interested in politics, attending political meetings with him, and even speaking at a few in her own right. After an unsuccessful first marriage, she married the Conservative politician Duncan Sandys. The couple had 3 children together, and like her mother, she became a very supportive political wife. However, during the 1950s, their marriage began to fall apart, and she suffered from severe mental health problems, which saw her hospitalized. Naturally monogamous, she never really got over her divorce from Duncan Sandys. However, during the final years of her life, she seemed to have found her vocation, working as a volunteer for the Samaritans. Helping suicidal people, her compassion shone through, and her kindness touched many people. Tragically, in October 1963, her own problems became just too much, and she committed suicide. Winston and Clementine's second daughter, Sarah, could not have been more different. While Diana shunned the limelight, Sarah loved it. Individualistic and rebellious, she became a dancer and actress. During the war, she gave up her career to do her duty on the home front and support her parents. Afterwards, she had a promising career in America, appearing in a Hollywood movie with Fred Astaire, on Broadway, and in the early days of American television. She was always on the cusp of fame. She was almost a great actress, nearly a great beauty, but she never quite made it. She had a self-destructive streak, which undermined her talent. Her love life was complicated. Unlike her sisters, she had no intention of settling down, which led to her being nicknamed in the family the Mule, because she was obstinate and she did not breed. Her personal life was full of tragedies. 2 of the men she loved most committed suicide, and when she believed that she'd found lasting happiness, her 3rd husband died of a stroke. Sarah turned to alcohol to deaden the pain of these disasters. There were a series of embarrassing incidents which culminated in her being remanded in custody in the hospital wing at Holloway Prison for a medical report for 10 days. Although her life was so difficult, Sarah never wallowed in self-pity. Her motto was to keep on dancing, and she did that to the very end. In contrast, the Churchills' youngest daughter, Mary, lived a very happy life. Blessed with a sanguine nature and a secure upbringing at Chartwell, she flourished. From her teenage years, she was exceptionally close to her mother, Clementine, and the whole family depended on her rock-like stability. After a very successful wartime career, she knew that she wanted to settle down and have a family. In the Conservative politician, Emma Soames, she found the ideal match. The couple had 5 children together, and she supported his career. However, Mary really was a woman who had it all, not all at the same time, but at different stages in her life. Unlike her sisters, she got the balance right between family and public life. In her later years, she became a successful author, writing an accomplished biography of her mother, Clementine, and a number of other books on her family. She became chairman of the board of trustees of the National Theatre and was made a Lady Companion of the Order of the Garter by the Queen, a very rare honour for a woman. My book is not set on the battlefields or in Parliament. It is an intimate family saga. It explores the dynamics of the Churchill family and shows the important roles Winston's daughters played in supporting him at crucial moments in his career, particularly during the war, when they travelled with him to international conferences at Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam. Too often in the past, the Churchill girls have been overlooked because their family was crammed full of larger-than-life characters. But I believe that their lives are well worth studying. They were exceptional women who had to learn how to live with the great expectations placed on them because of their famous name. They faced more than their fair share of tragedy, but through it all, they showed a resilience and courage which was worthy of their father. What also impressed me was a deep bond between them. Their sisterly solidarity survived many challenges. Their letters highlight their indestructible relationship. In later life, as they remembered all they'd been through together, Mary wrote to Sarah, "I cling to our loving bond of sisterhood and know that it is one of the most precious things in my life." Sarah agreed, replying, "Out of it all comes a shining light for me. We were really sisters." Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to taking your questions later on in this session. Thank you.
Rachel, thank you very much. And if we can go straight to Catherine.
Hello, thank you so much everyone for joining today or this evening. I am in Chicago, so it's afternoon for me. Thank you so much, Rachel, for your wonderful book and for this illustration of the lives of the Churchill sisters. They're each remarkable in their own way, and I'm so lucky to have had the privilege of getting to know one of them in particular, and that, of course, is Sarah. And my path to getting to know Sarah is a bit unusual. It was filled with a series of coincidences. I had studied Churchill as an undergraduate and graduate student at Harvard and Cambridge, but had actually left history for a short time to work in finance in New York City when, lo and behold, there was a bookstore in the lobby of my office called Chartwell Booksellers, which specialized in books by and about Winston Churchill. And it was through the owner of the bookstore that I first connected with the International Churchill Society and Emma Soames and the rest of her wonderful family. And it was shortly after this first meeting with them in New York City that I learned that the papers of Sarah Churchill were being opened at the Churchill Archive Center for the first time. And the Churchill Society kindly asked if I'd be interested in writing an article about them for their magazine Finest Hour, which is such a fascinating publication. So if you haven't had a chance to take a look yet, I highly recommend it. So I had this wonderful opportunity to write an article about Sarah Churchill and come to know her in a different way than many have previously. So to illustrate that, I thought I would share a couple of photographs with you to talk a little bit more about Sarah and her remarkable life, especially her fascinating wartime experience at her father's side. If people know Sarah today, as Rachel mentioned, it's often in the context of her having been an actress and a dancer. And she did, in fact, star in a film with Fred Astaire called Royal Wedding in 1951. And this was really the height of her fame and success as an actress and dancer. It certainly fulfilled a childhood dream of getting to dance with Fred Astaire. But my first encounter with Sarah actually came much earlier, and this was when I was a child. My family always goes to the cloister at Sea Island, Georgia every summer, and I had the great pleasure of seeing this beautiful photograph of Sarah on the wall of the lobby of the cloister every summer. My family still goes there. And this is a picture of Sarah on her wedding day in 1949, where she had eloped to Sea Island with her second husband, Anthony Beecham. And I just was so struck by this photograph and this beautiful young woman, and really curious to know more about her life. And so now I found myself with this coincidental opportunity to get to know her, and this woman from this photograph that I had seen every summer since I was literally a baby. And what I came to realize as I got to know Sarah through the opportunity to look through her papers and perform research at the Churchill Archive Center was a young woman who was very complex and brilliant and had so many of her father's gifts, and also had a truly special bond with her father from the time that she was a little girl. Sarah would say that she could understand the way that her father's mind worked, such that if he wasn't speaking, she could walk in silent step with him, knowing his every thought, just because of this bond that they shared. And much of it was because of this time that they spent together when Sarah was a little girl in the garden at Chartwell, while Churchill was engaged in one of his favorite pastimes, which was bricklaying. Sarah would be out there in the garden with him as his bricklaying assistant, and they would pass many quiet, contemplative hours together, really sharing this wonderful time together as father and daughter. Sarah was very stubborn. Of course, her nickname Mule tells a lot about that aspect of her personality. But she was also very much like her father in the sense that she was determined to chart her own course and to make a name for herself on her own terms. And for a young woman of this class in this era, there weren't very many career opportunities open to her. It certainly was not expected that she would attend university, rather that she would become a debutante and get married. But Sarah wanted a different life for herself, and one of the few avenues open to her was as an actress and dancer. This may seem somewhat scandalous. Perhaps Sarah's grandmother, the American debutante Jenny Jerome, Winston's mother, had paved this path a little bit for her. Jenny Jerome had written plays for the West End, which was a bit scandalous in her day. So surprisingly, Winston was not entirely opposed to Sarah pursuing this path. But despite how hard she fought to carve out this career for herself, when the war broke out, Sarah decided to leave it all aside and do her bit for her country. She joined the women's branch of the Royal Air Force, where she served as a photographic intelligence analyst, looking at recon photos that had been taken thousands of feet in the sky by pilots and making intelligence assessments based on these photographs in support of Allied operations, specifically in the Mediterranean, in particular Operation Torch. So what Sarah would do, she would look at these photographs taken thousands of feet in the sky, photos of harbors, trying to determine what types of ships were in the harbors based on the kinds of shadows that they cast, or looking at fields where grass had been trampled and trying to determine, was this an enemy troop movement, or was it simply cows grazing that had moved on to another field? And sometimes Sarah knew the details of these operations even better than her father did, much to his great pride and great amusement. And there's a wonderful anecdote of him telling the story to Eleanor Roosevelt about how much Sarah knew, which Eleanor Roosevelt ended up repeating to the press. And Sarah ended up called in front of her superiors wanting to know who had leaked this information about operations to the press. And of course, Sarah could only reply that it was her father bragging about her. Sarah also had a fascinating second component to her wartime experience, as Rachel mentioned. And this was that she had the opportunity to travel with her father to not one, but two of his overseas conferences, the Tehran Conference in 1943 and the Yalta Conference in 1945. Early in the war, Winston and Clementine had decided that when he traveled abroad, someone from the family should accompany him on his travels as a confidant and supporter, but it had an additional layer to this role as well. They knew that Winston would want to write his wartime memoirs when it was all over, much as he had done after the First World War, and they wanted someone there with him who could record things that were taking place outside of the official conference discussions on the official record. And instead, these were more of the personal aspects and behind the scenes looks at these remarkable moments in history. And for many reasons, Sarah was the perfect person to fill all of these roles. Given the strength of the bond that she had with her father from the time she was a little girl, she really understood, much like her mother did, just how his mind worked, how to help him take his myriad thoughts and frustrations, especially towards the end of the war, and channel them in the most productive line of conversation before he would go into the conference room. She was also a brilliant political thinker in many ways. She really had her father's gift for understanding the dynamics of politics within the British domestic political landscape, as well as having had exposure to more of the foreign aspects of diplomacy and foreign policy from her work as a WAF. Sarah was also a beautiful writer. She really had so many of her father's gifts with the written word, and you could really hear his voice reflected in hers. And so for these various reasons, she's an actress, which lends itself so well to diplomacy. She is an astute political thinker. She understands her father's mind, and she is a great writer. She really is the perfect person to accompany him to the Tehran Conference in 1943, which was the first time Churchill, FDR, and Stalin all met together in person. This is a photograph of Sarah at the Tehran Conference, and you can see she really is truly in the mix. She's not in the conference negotiations themselves. She's instead waiting in the antechamber with the other aides de camp, yet another person in her uniform fulfilling her duty. But at this conference, several other fathers began to take notice of just how valuable she was to her father. These two individuals were the American ambassador to the Soviet Union, Averell Harriman, and the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt. So by the time the Yalta Conference came in February 1945, they too realized that the person who could best serve at their side as their aides at Yalta would be their daughters as well. So you can really see Sarah at her groundbreaking role there, paving the way for other young women to have this opportunity to witness history right on the precipice between World War and Cold War. This is a photograph of Sarah and her fellow daughters at the Yalta Conference. You can see Sarah in her military uniform, her WAF uniform. In the middle is Anna Roosevelt, who, so I'd say Sarah was 30 years old at the time of Yalta. Anna Roosevelt in the middle was 38 years old and the mother of three. And on the other side is Kathleen Harriman in this lovely fur coat, and Kathleen was just 27 years old. And it's remarkable to think about not only the history that these three women witnessed, but this unique role that they played, where they served as, I would consider it, daughter diplomats in a sense, where they're there as quasi-official members of the delegation, where they don't speak for the government necessarily as one might for the State Department or the Foreign Office, but they speak with the weight of their fathers behind them, such that they are, forces to be reckoned with in their own right as well. And this kind of betwixt and between role allows them to have subtle, nuanced conversations, deliver these important messages that someone in an official capacity might not be able to do, to gather information and report back to their fathers, including the opportunity to go out into the local community to meet the local people in the Crimea whose lives have been devastated by the fighting over the last number of years, and whose futures are literally being reordered by the conversations taking place in the conference room at that very moment. And then they're able to come back and tell their fathers about what they've seen and reflect on the differences between the Soviet leadership and the regular Soviet people, from which she really sees a lot of hope in the future in her interactions with the people in the Crimea, which is really just quite stunning. At the Yalta Conference, Sarah really was the person that her father turned to as he was having increasing frustration with especially Franklin Roosevelt at this time. He and Roosevelt had a great personal friendship that really was the basis for the special relationship, and they truly admired and respected each other. But at this point in the war, Roosevelt's attention had shifted somewhat. He could see that the Soviet Union was rising in strength, and the British Empire, by comparison, was not nearly as strong as it had been at the outset of the war. So Roosevelt was really determined to build this personal bond with Stalin, much like he had with Churchill while at Yalta. And unfortunately, that meant at times kind of pushing Churchill to the side, shutting him out, and not arguing forcefully with him with a united front against Stalin, especially on issues like Polish sovereignty, which was very important to Winston Churchill, given that the British went to war in defense of Polish sovereignty at the outset. And so it was Sarah who was the person who Churchill could turn to as his trusted confidant in an environment where spies abounded, you never knew who was listening. And then it was Sarah who really was the one person that he trusted above all in this atmosphere. Sarah was astutely observant. She could tell from the moment that she met with Roosevelt after first meeting him at Tehran in 1943, and then again when they arrive first at Malta on the way to Yalta, that something is different about Roosevelt. She can't quite put her finger on it, whether it's because he's sick or because he has diverged somewhat from them and British interests. And unbeknownst to her, she was right on both counts. Throughout the duration of the conference, Sarah would sit up long into the night till the small hours in the morning, sitting with her father really as almost kind of like a sort of privy counselor, along with Anthony Eden and Churchill's doctor, Lord Moran, where Sarah and Eden would really help him think through his frustration with Roosevelt, especially towards Poland at this time. And so she's there, it's not just, a supporter kind of as a human interest sidelight as she's often been represented in history previously. And you can also see a Sarah who's very different than one that people might know later, where she did really face numerous struggles in her personal life. But you can see a young woman really coming into her own during the war, where she's able to use the gifts and talents and experiences that she has, where she really, I believe, had she been born perhaps 10 years later, could have succeeded her father into politics, given that her natural abilities were so much like his. And so for me, it was just a wonderful experience to be, I'm now the same age that Sarah was at Yalta, and to think about what it would have been like to be Sarah or the other two daughters at the Yalta Conference on the forefront of history. But you can also, just see the strength of the bond and the deep respect and admiration that Churchill had for the women in his life, especially his wife and daughters, through his reliance on them in these fundamental moments in history, like at Yalta. And then, of course, immediately after, of course, in the wake of the devastating election results in the summer of 1945, and then he retreats to Lake Como to kind of gather himself and find a new place for himself in the world after the pace and trying nature of the last half decade. And once again, Lake Como, it's Sarah who is at his side as he is trying to grapple with what has come over these last 5 years and what the future might hold. So a very different look at Sarah, especially this slice of time here during the Second World War, where she had such a unique look at history and really was one that her father deeply respected and admired, and for good reason.
Catherine, wonderful. Thank you so much. And if we can now turn to our third speaker, Emma Soames.
Hello, good afternoon or good morning. It's lovely to be here, and I'm so happy to be talking about my specialist subject, or who has become my specialist subject, my dear mother. I was born at Chartwell Farm, which is the farm in the valley underneath Chartwell itself. So I have childhood memories of tea at Chartwell, and I spent a great deal of time with my grandparents. But of course, being a child, it never occurred to me to question either my grandfather's status or indeed the relationship between my mother and my parents and my grandparents, which was always, I have to say, incredibly close. But with the selfishness of youth, I never asked any of these questions, which of course, now doing some work on my mother's wartime diaries, I rather wish I had. My mother, the first thing I have to say is that due to the sad death of Marigold, who would have come between Sarah and Mary, there is a large age gap between my mother and her older siblings. And for that reason, and also for the reason of the circumstances of Marigold's death, which was incredibly sad, and Clementine, I think, was absolutely distraught at the death of this little girl, but also I think felt incredibly guilty that the woman she had hired to look after this child was a governess rather than a nanny, when at that age, little Marigold needed, a nanny, really. Thanks to that and the age gap, when my mother was born, Clementine hired somebody called Marigold White, who known to me for all my life as Nana or Grandnana. And she brought up my mother at Chartwell, and she instilled into my mother, first of all, a deep faith, a deep Christian faith. She also instilled in her a great love of animals. My mother had the most incredible menagerie of goats and chickens and dogs and I know not what else at Chartwell. And she was incredibly close to Nana. And in fact, Clementine became a little bit jealous of this relationship. And then when my mother was a teenager, Clementine took her skiing, and they just went skiing on their own, the two of them. And that is really where the bond between my mother and my grandmother was born. But she was, in her memoir, A Daughter's Tale, she calls herself the Chartwell child, because really by the time she was 5 or 6, her elder siblings had all left home. Diana got married very young. Randolph was being Randolph. And Sarah was, I'm not quite sure what Sarah was doing at that point, but they were not living at Chartwell. And so she had a sort of lovely childhood at Chartwell, but not that close to her parents. But then when war broke out, Mary was 16, and in January 1939, when with great prescience, and also with the family gene of writing them well, she started keeping a diary. And it is these diaries that I, with the immense help of Alan Packwood and his colleague, Catherine Thompson, I'm now editing for publication later this year. And they are, I'm not trying to, well, it's got nothing to do with me, but they are completely riveting. And I have seen, it is extraordinary, dealing with a parent's diaries when they are young, because I see how my mother's personality developed. And the guiding light of her personality was that basically she hadn't been that close to her father. He was busy building walls. I mean, he was at Chartwell a lot because he was out of power, but he, you know, he wasn't really great with small children, I don't think, Grandpapa. He wasn't that interested. She got to know her father, and she, a great admiration for him was born. And it was almost here, I mean, it was definitely hero worship. And I could see from the day on she made her first speech when she was 18 years old on the green at Westerham, which is the local village to Chartwell. It was Weapons War Week, and my mother opened it. And she said she just thought that one thought that was in her head is that she did not want to let her father down. And if there is one phrase in the diaries that stays with me to this day, that was my mother's sort of leitmotif all her life. And it is how in later life, after sadly her parents died, and then her husband, Christopher Soames, my father, died, she became the sort of keeper of the flame, if you like, and a terrific matriarch. And she certainly kept an eye on books that were being written, and people were immensely respectful of her because she, you know, she was like the last of the Mohicans, if you like. You know, she really knew him. And I would not like to get into a discussion about which of his children he preferred, but he certainly spent more time with Mary than possibly the other children, but that was because she was around more. Her war was, she knew she was being a great support to her parents in the dark days of 1940 and 41, in really desperate times. She went to the Commons, she heard all his speeches from the Strangers' Gallery or the Speakers' Gallery. And, but she ached to join, to do more for the war effort. And so one day at Chequers, she and her best friend, Judy Montague, was sort of sitting, listening to a conversation between WSC and a man called General Sir Frederick Pyle, who was head of Home Command or Home Defences. And he said he wanted women to join the ATS, to join the anti-aircraft batteries, because of conscription. There weren't enough male soldiers. They all had to go to the front. So instantly, my mother and Judy knew exactly what they wanted to do. And indeed, their wish was granted. They joined the ATS. My mother became a gunner, and she had rather a distinguished military career, which is that she ended up as a captain with a military MBE. And what is really touching was how incredibly proud Winston was of Mary's achievements in the army. And her battery towards the end of the war, when the Doodlebugs were coming over, she was stationed at Hyde Park. And her battery received almost more visits from officials in talks with Winston Churchill than it did Doodlebugs. He was forever tootling down there to show off with great pride his daughter's achievements with the guns, which were still hot from the previous night's firing. Catherine has given an extraordinarily good description of what an ADC does. And my mother did an amazing trip with him to go to the Quebec conference in 1943, with Clementine. She was also there. So it was a big, half the Queen Mary was taken up with the Churchill contingent going to Quebec and then on to the White House. My mother's got this very good line. Somebody said to her, "Oh, when did you first go to America?" And she said, "Oh, I think I was about 19 and we stayed at the White House," which is a very good throwaway line in my opinion, but it was also completely true. And my mother had great charm, and Roosevelt rather fell for her, I think, because there are endless descriptions in the diary of how, if a dinner after the talks, an intimate dinner in the White House, more often than not, my mother sat next to Roosevelt, very often. And, but she's quite beady, my mother. Well, she was always pretty beady. And her description of her analysis of Roosevelt's character and what made him tick is really riveting in my view. So she did that. She was ADC for him on that trip. And then she also went to Potsdam in 1945, which rather fell apart when the general election results came in halfway through, and Churchill came home to watch in for the results, thinking he would go back to Potsdam, but of course he never did. But while she was in Potsdam, she said in a letter to her mother, she said, when she was sort of arranging the flowers and moving all the furniture around this sort of odd lodge that they were all in. And so my mother sort of made herself useful in whatever way she could. And she wrote to Clementine, "I'm trying to beat my sword into a feather duster." So then at the end of the war, my grandparents leave number 10 Downing Street, buy a house in Hyde Park Gate. And at that point, my mother does leave the army because she feels very much that her parents need her. And in fact, Clementine, I think, wrote to her saying as much. And also, I can get it up here. Sorry, I'm not as technically whizzy as Catherine. I can't do it. It's gone back to the beginning. Winston wrote Mary the most charming letter at the end of the war, saying, "Please come home. We love you so much, and you will always have a home with your mother and I." It's just adorable. And indeed, she then met Christopher Soames in the embassy in Paris. And dear reader, she married him. And they started their married life in Chartwell Farm, where they lived for about nearly 10 years until they had so many children. They had to move house, but we always lived nearby. I mean, we moved, instead of being 3 minutes away, we lived 1 hour away. And my mother she was the least, I hate to say this, but actually she was the least feminist person you can imagine. But she was a child of her age. I mean, she certainly believed in universal suffrage and the votes for women. Of course she did. But what I mean is that she did not think, right, I need a career of my own. First of all, she supported her father. Then she spent 30 years bringing up children and very much being a support to my father in his political career. And they ended up at the embassy in Paris. And they also then, of course, he was the last Governor General of what was just still called Southern Rhodesia at that point. And he had a fascinating career, and she was by his side for all of it. And it was only after she lost her beloved Christopher in 1987 that she built a life of her own, if you like, I mean, a professional life of her own. And she turned out to be, she had not been to university. She had no particular professional qualifications, but she became a very good author, admittedly with some ravishingly wonderful material, but you know, you've got to learn to work with it. And her biography of her mother, Clementine, won the Wolfson Prize, which was a matter of huge pride to her and indeed all the family. And then she edited the letters between themselves, the letters between her parents. And then she wrote, towards the end of her life, she wrote a charming memoir called A Daughter's Tale, which has been, I have to say, not far from my side while I've been editing these absolutely fascinating diaries. She, in terms of her relationships with her siblings, they all got on pretty well, except for Randolph, and who caused terrific upset, not just to his father, but to his mother, and above all to his mother. And the girls, certainly Mary, and I think I probably can talk for Sarah as well, were terrifically protective of Winston around Randolph, who really did behave like a sort of brute. But the girls between each other all got on very, very well. And I remember in my childhood, both Diana and Sarah coming down to where we lived, and these wonderful women with fabulous skin and red hair getting out of the back of lovely cars in fur coats, and were all very sweet to us. But we didn't see a lot of them, it has to be said. And we were quite a unit because we were 5 children living in, you know, Sussex. But the siblings got on fine, with the glowing exception of Randolph. And now I am having such pleasure in rediscovering what made my mother tick, really. And it was a very good vintage. Thank you.
Emma, thank you so much. To use a Churchill family expression, wow. And that applies to all 3 of our speakers equally. Now, normally, the problem facing a chair at this point is that there might not be any questions, and that therefore he or she might have to come up very quickly with a question to ask the panelists. Absolutely no such problem today. The questions have been flooding in, and we've got an awful lot to work through. But Emma, I wanted to start, if I can, with something particular for you, because you talked about the impact of Marigold's death on your grandparents and on Clementine. And of course, one of the questions that's come in is from Julian Moss, asking why it is that Marigold was buried in Kensal Green Cemetery rather than at the family plot in Blaydon. And I think you wanted to say a few words about this.
Thank you. Julian, yes, I'm very happy to address this question because it has been preying on the collective minds of the family for some years now. Why she was buried in the first place in Kensal Green, I cannot answer exactly, but one, at that time, there was no family plot. I mean, it was only my grandfather who decided to be buried with his Marlborough friends and relations at Blaydon. And until then, there was no such thing. Plus which I think my grandmother was truly, genuinely, deeply distraught by the death of this little girl. And not much thought was given to where she was going to be buried. However, she did have a very good gravestone, which a fact we've only just discovered, because about 3 years ago, we decided we'd get Marigold moved to Blaydon, to the family plot. But my goodness, that's easier said than done. And quite rightly so too. You can't go moving your family around the countryside. And it needs special permission from the council, and that's only the beginning of it. Then you've got to go to a bishop. And then the last thing was we discovered that it had a gravestone by Eric Gill, which was broken, vandalized, but nonetheless it was sort of protected. Anyway, eventually, thanks to our family lawyer who got the bit between her teeth and really was going to solve this, a year ago, we had a little service in Blaydon Church, and the remains of Marigold Churchill were moved, and now she is buried in the same plot as my mother and her parents. And it gives us all, we feel that that was something we really needed to do, and we're very, very happy that she's there. And she has a little, it's not a headstone, but it's a plaque. So she is no longer in Kensal Green, but where she belongs with her parents.
Thank you very much for answering that and addressing that. So a question has come in from Elliot Clark, which is, I think, for Rachel in the first instance. Elliot asks, do you think that if Diana Churchill had possessed more confidence, she would have made a successful politician by herself?
I do, actually. I feel that any of the daughters might have done better than Randolph. Diana actually was the most keen on political ideas of any of the daughters. And although she didn't do very well at school, she could write a really good essay on things like tariff reform. And she really enjoyed going out with her father on the campaign trail before she was married. I think, though, it would have been really hard for her to do it because she really did not have much ego. I think out of any of the family, there was just no ego there. She was better at supporting other people. And that's the role that I saw again in her life, that if anyone was in trouble, she was the person there for them. But I think, as I say, she loved political ideas. And when she'd had her breakdown and went to stay in the south of France with Sarah and with Winston, Sarah wrote to Clementine saying, you know, Diana really needs philosophy. She needs to get her teeth into an idea. And that gave her a way of switching off from her worries. So maybe she'd have been a political philosopher. But as I say, I think she could have made a good politician in a different era. So,
Catherine, Diana, too little ego, perhaps, to go into politics. Did Sarah have too much?
I don't know if there's a limit on ego if it goes into politics. But I do think that Sarah would have made a brilliant politician. She had an astute grasp of domestic policy. There's a wonderful letter that she wrote during the general election, kind of responding to one of her father's broadcasts, reflecting on the way her colleagues were hearing his words and kind of thinking about the post-war climate. People who had put up with so much suffering, their homes had been lost, they'd been enduring rationing for such a long time, and people feeling that they needed something in exchange for kind of the service that they've gone through. Not much, but just a little bit more recognition politically. And she recognizes these feelings. She's worked with people of all different stations through her work as an actress and as a WAF. And she was very good at articulating this. And I think that there's so much similarity between acting and politics, the public performance aspect of it. And then she had the real, insight and brilliance in her writing and communication, much like her father. I don't know if it would have occurred to her that she could have had a career in politics. I think it's easy to kind of impose our own worldview today on people who lived a long time ago. And I wish that she would have thought that she could have had a career in politics. But I agree. I think she and her sisters would have made fantastic politicians in their own right had they considered that was something that they could do, perhaps even better than Randolph. But he was a great orator as well. So you can see many Churchillian gifts in the next generation.
Again, that perhaps leads into a question from Neil Taylor. And he asks you if Sarah actually had, in your view, any influence on policies that were adopted at Tehran and at Yalta. Obviously, she's there as an assistant and as an aide to her father, which you brought out beautifully. But is she actually able, through the sort of the lunchtime discussion, through those private meetings, did you detect any influence, any shaping of policy?
What I detected was more kind of a confirming of worldview, in a sense, where Winston has, a strong dedication to securing a free and unfettered election in Poland at the end of the war. Stalin, of course, has other ideas and can back up his own perspective with the Red Army, which has boots on the ground. But Sarah really is kind of speaking with her father late at night, confirming for him that, yes, his views on Poland are right. He is frustrated with Roosevelt, and then kind of helping him craft that into a more articulate and productive line of discussion rather than just pure frustration. And I also think that her opportunity to go and meet local people in the community surrounding Yalta and then come back and report to her father on that kind of helps to reinforce this idea of, yes, the Soviet leadership is very difficult and there will be challenges with them in the post-war period, but in the long run, there is hope. Because regular people all around the world have so much in common. And so I think that long-term perspective and also just the physical presence that she has as a representative of the next generation helps to maintain the sense of hope, even in a time that's fraught with immense frustration for Winston Churchill.
And Emma, then, do you see Mary playing a sort of similar role to that at Quebec and at Potsdam? And of course, there was and there is talk in her diaries. She sort of briefly contemplates the possibility of going into politics. Various people say to her that she should consider it. What sort of politician would she have made?
Well, I think one of my mother's other characteristics is that she was extraordinarily conscientious. So I think anything she put her mind to, she would have done to her very, she might have been, and people loved her because she was very charming. I think what she was very well informed. Well, you would be if you were living at number 10 Downing Street during the war. So, and she became rather sort of hooked on hearing news before everybody, you read it in the newspapers. And I think that is it is a trait of many politicians. The first thing they miss when they leave office is the red box. They're no longer in the sort of the inner circle. But I never heard her yearn for a political career herself, but she was very interested, and she was sort of quite often didn't know what to think. That was her problem. I mean, that she wouldn't have made a very good politician, actually, because she was too, should I think this or should I think that? I mean, she had very strong opinions on some things, but not on everything. So I think she would have passed on that. But of course, she was extremely flattered, and who wouldn't be, that if you're Winston Churchill's daughter and somebody thinks you should go into politics, my goodness, it would turn anybody's head, wouldn't it?
Okay. Well, this leads perhaps to a question that's come in from, and I'm probably going to mispronounce this, so I apologize, Lona Kemeleva from the Ukraine. There's a lot that's been discussed about Churchill's view on female suffrage and how perhaps in the sort of Edwardian period he was ambiguous on it. And a lot has been written about Clementine Churchill's influence on him in actually changing his view over time. And Lona's question is, do you discern an impact from the daughters in promoting women's rights, or just perhaps from their own actions and their own careers in sort of changing his view towards women's roles more generally? And maybe, Rachel, we can start with you.
Yes, I think there was a real change, and I think he grew in so much in respect for his daughters with their war work, and that his view began to be that women did not just need to be the supports of men, they could also play a very active role in their own lives, in the political lives. But I think after the war too, it was interesting because Sarah gave Winston advice in the 1945 election about the need to appeal to people with a good housing policy and to make war on the need for creating housing in the same way he'd fought the Germans. But also she could see the future of politics with the sort of new techniques that would come in. And with Anthony Beecham, she advised him on how to use television as a new medium. And actually at one point even wanted him to broadcast regularly to the United States, which he said, actually, I really can't do this while I'm Prime Minister, I'm busy enough as it is. So I think his attitude really did change to women during that time. But I think, as Emma said, I don't think any of them would have called themselves feminists, any of the daughters. Sarah lived a very feminist life, actually, but that was more a personal crusade than a political creed.
Okay, Catherine or Emma, do you want to come in on this one?
I think that it is certainly true. Everything that Rachel says, I completely agree with. I think that, they wouldn't have labeled themselves feminists. I don't think you think of Winston Churchill as a feminist, but you do see genuine and deep respect that he has for the women closest to him, his wife and his daughters. Clementine really was, the kind of at the core of his, group of people counseling and advising him, and anything that he kind of, it's true of all politicians or leaders, that the thoughts and ideas expressed by one person is often the product of many individuals working in the background who don't often get that outward recognition. But it's every person is very important, and for him, his daughters and wife were certainly a huge part of that. But what's really striking to me is that, well, you don't necessarily think of Winston Churchill as a feminist or a crusader for women's rights. And you think of FDR as much more of that person, and he and Eleanor together during the war, having served, this very progressive sort of administration where women were brought into the administration, female journalists were advanced, really was, so much of that thanks to Eleanor especially. But in the treatment of his own daughter, he didn't have nearly the same sort of progressive outlook for her, and really still had much of the kind of old-fashioned view of women are here to support and to, as his daughter said, frustratedly with him once, to keep the home fires burning. And that's not something that you see Winston Churchill's daughters saying. And so it is very striking that, while Churchill is not outwardly the political kind of crusader for women, but he did in his own personal conduct have a great deal more respect and even conception of kind of what women could contribute on a personal level than did FDR, which is something that I think surprises people sometimes.
Yes, I would just like to add the woman who really had the greatest influence on Winston was Clementine, because he really got quite a lot of things wrong in his career. For instance, the abdication, and she put him right about that. Alan, help me out here. Well, votes for women. Yep. She put him right on that. And he really listened to her. And she also once or twice took him up on his behavior at the beginning of the war. He was sort of barking at his secretaries or something. And, Clementine said, you really don't behave like that. And my goodness, he listened. He listened to Clementine all his life. And I think probably the girls respected that relationship in terms of giving him advice, as it was best coming, well, not best coming from Clementine, but she was very bright, Clementine, and provided a clear and also not always agreeing with him by any manner of means.
And I think it's interesting. I think they all learned a very valuable lesson, which was that if you wanted him to take notice of something, then the best way was to submit it to him in writing rather than to talk to him. Yes. So, of course, it means they wrote these most amazing letters, which survive in the archive. Okay, so what you've just brought out is that he develops an immense pride in their achievements and admiration for them. But we have an interesting question from Dave Travis, who asks, while of course, he was, inevitably a hero for all of them, who else did they admire in that sort of Churchill inner circle? Who were the heroes for Mary, Diana, and Sarah? Catherine, maybe you want to go first on this one.
Yes, so I think that even though by the time of the Yalta Conference, the relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt was breaking down somewhat in world outlook, Sarah still had an enormous respect for Franklin Roosevelt. And you can see this in her writing at the Tehran Conference, that so much of the respect and admiration that Winston has, she also holds. And there's a moment where he wants to toast her and her contribution to the conference. And he says, if only I could get up and come to you. But of course, he could not because he was paralyzed. And so he, toasts Sarah from across the table. And she's just so touched by this. And she does see this depth of humanity in this man, much like she sees in her father. And so that's why it is so crushing by the time that they arrive at Yalta, that this relationship is breaking down, because Sarah, like her father, has a huge amount of respect and admiration for Franklin Roosevelt, and really believes in the strength of the personal bond between her father and his American counterpart.
And then Rachel, do you want to come in on this one?
I'd just say that I think Mary actually got on rather well with de Gaulle. During the war, she travelled with her father, met him, and they went on a train trip, and he gave her a little badge at the end of it, the Croix de Lorraine. And I think then when she was the ambassadress in Paris, she wrote about going to his memorial service, and she wanted to do that as a mark of respect for de Gaulle, and she saw his death as very much the end of an era. So obviously she also admired people like Roosevelt, but I think, they really, the person for them above all was their father, because they met so many people, but the outstanding person was always their father, I think, for them.
And Emma, you want to come in?
Well, I think that the people that my mother admired were sort of closer to home than the people who were around Chequers, where she was every weekend. And it really was Harry Hopkins, Averil Harriman, and Gil Wynant. And she got on very well with them. And I think she had enormous respect for them. And also, of course, it was such a relief that here were these Americans helping to get the message across back to Washington, that you've got to join in. And also there were lots of people like Jock Colville, Pug Ismay, Prof. Lindemann, who she was really quite close to, or rather she saw a lot of. And she had a massive affection for all of them, I think.
Okay. All right, well, moving on, I think we probably have to address the elephant in the room. And this is something that's been sort of touched on earlier, and that's the relationship with their brother and with Randolph. Which I think, as with many family relationships, is a very complex one. So we have a question from Marina Brownshire, who of course is a great granddaughter of Sir Winston and a granddaughter of Randolph. And she asks, to what extent you've looked and examined the relationship between the girls and their brother, and if you'd like to sort of comment on it further. So perhaps, Rachel, this would be to you in the first instance.
Yes, Diana and Randolph were very, very close because of age, particularly when they were small, and they were sort of terrible twosome at times with their nannies and things. And they always had a very close relationship, particularly as children. And when Randolph suffered abuse at prep school, he told Diana, and it's through her that his father found out and went and dealt with it all. But because of age, they were very close, whereas Mary was a lot younger, as Emma mentioned. Sarah was also pretty close to Randolph, although she was protective of her father when Randolph behaved very badly. And there are letters she wrote after Randolph died, which show that she felt it was tremendous loss. She wrote to his children saying, "A great oak tree has fallen, but we must carry on." And he'd always tried to sort of intervene in Sarah's life. When she eloped to America with her first husband, Vic Oliver, Randolph was sent to pursue her across the Atlantic in a rival liner. And he went out there. And at that time, he was sensitive enough to see, writing back to his father, that Sarah actually was really in love with Vic. And the more they tried to do something against it, the more she would dig her heels in and be obstinate, and that she would marry him. I think Mary had more problems perhaps with Randolph, and particularly during the war, when Randolph behaved very badly and Clementine banned him from their home for that period. And Mary was really upset by it all. And I think at one point, there was a real rift between them. But I think they all had very different relationships with him.
Okay, Emma or Catherine?
Shall I go next? Just to analyze for a second the problem with Randolph. One was that he was unbearably spoilt by his father. I mean, on one level, it must have been rather hurtful to the daughters, because Randolph could do no wrong in Winston's eyes. And he could behave appallingly. And the form his bad behavior took, he was very over-entitled, Randolph. And he thought that, because his father was a great man, Randolph was a great man, he should instantly have a seat. And, he then lost his deposit, which rather taught him a lesson. And that he should practically have a seat in cabinet, just because he was Winston's child. He was really over-entitled. And he had a disastrous relationship with his mother, who he thought was trying to keep him from his father. And indeed, on one level, she was, because she was trying to protect Winston from this sort of drunken maelstrom that used to rip through the house occasionally, leaving a trail of unhappiness in his wake. So that was the problem with Randolph, really. And it was really very sad, because he'd never had any discipline in his life. And my mother, in the diaries, when she has this great falling out with Randolph, there's this rather sort of sadness about, it's because he's a boy and we're all girls, so we don't matter. I mean, it is truly almost shocking to read from the perspective of 70 years later. But he was, Grandpapa was a very, very old-fashioned man, and boys were, you needed, once you had a son, that was fine. But poor Winston, in a way, reaped a storm from treating his son so indulgently, because it caused all these great unhappy relationships between the rest of his family.
Catherine, do you want to come in on this one?
Yeah, I think it's specifically the relationship with Randolph and Sarah. They were very close on the one hand, and as Rachel mentioned, kind of chasing after Sarah as she's eloping. It's a great dramatic scene, and it really is kind of this lovely, poignant moment between brother and sister as well. And they did continue to have this great love and affection for each other. But Sarah was really, in many ways, like the peacemaker in the family, trying to balance the relationships, some of which were enormous personalities clashing at times. And of course, with Emma here, I don't want to speak beyond kind of my knowledge as a historian specifically about Sarah in this period, and can't help but feel a bit of an imposter commenting on the personal relationships of a family when family members are present, of course.
Right ahead.
But I think that for Sarah,
anybody else, sorry.
Sarah, really, she's kind of always inserting herself as the peacemaker in the family. She is trying to manage relationships by willingly covering up for the affair between Averil Harriman and her sister-in-law, Pamela, kind of giving Randolph and Pamela her apartment when Randolph comes home from leave during the war. The Pamela and Randolph, of course, had a very stormy relationship. Both of them had huge personalities. neither one necessarily the most faithful of spouses, but Sarah trying to keep the peace for the greater good between them there. And then you see herself inserting herself kind of in, putting herself in the firing line between her brother and her father during dinners. At one point, during a dinner with some military leaders, Randolph has kind of an outburst, and Sarah tries to calm him down, and he ends up, I don't know how it happened, but kind of hitting her in the face. I don't know if it was intentional or just flailing, but it is a very kind of an overabundance of personalities that Sarah is trying to manage, and maybe that is because she is in the middle of the family, the middle child, or if that's just her more natural peacemaking personality. But you see those clashes between Randolph and Sarah, not necessarily because they are at odds, but just because of the family roles that they play, kind of pit them against each other at times.
Well, I hope we're not opening up family tensions on these issues again now. So I'm going to move to another question. This one comes from Eugene McCullough, and it takes us back to where we started with the nicknames. Eugene asks, of Winston's adult daughters, which matched best their family nicknames? And I'll remind you of those nicknames. So Diana was the puppy kitten, and of course that nickname comes from the fact that Winston would sign his letters to Clementine as a pug, and Clementine would sign off as a cat. So the puppy kitten is a combination of the two. Sarah was the mule or bumblebee, and Mary was Maria or the mouse. Which best fits their nicknames, and why? And Emma, we'll start with you.
Well, I think probably the Sarah being the mule is probably the most. I mean, my mother was called Mouse because she was a baby, I think. But I mean, at least a less mousy woman, it would be hard to imagine. But Sarah could be pretty mulish, I think. So I would say that was the most appropriate one.
Okay, Catherine?
I would completely agree, and I think Sarah would agree with that. She called herself the mule. She'd sign off some of her letters as a mule. She was a great artist, had a lot of her father's artistic talent, and sometimes she employed that in drawing little sketches of mules on her letters to Clementine, which are really quite charming, and I came across some of these in my research at the Churchill Archive Center, so that's a great treat in the archive there. She was stubborn. She owned her stubbornness. She, much of the, she had her father's spirit. She wanted to carve out a name for herself and chart her own path, which wasn't always the easiest thing to do, and sometimes not even in her own best interest at times. But she was very aware of who she was and was proud of that, and fully embraced her nickname.
Okay, and Rachel, the last word for you.
I agree too. Definitely Sarah was the mule. And when Anthony Beecham wrote to Winston when their marriage was falling apart, he said, you know how obstinate she is, and that can make it very difficult to live with her. But as I say, she was humorous about it, and she gave that nickname to herself. And those drawings are lovely, as Catherine says in those letters, of the mule in various different positions. And Clementine once used it in a letter saying, when Sarah had looked after Winston when he was very ill in Morocco, when Clementine was in England, and she said, what we really need though is a series of mules, because she's such a hard-working animal.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think what you've shown is, of course, that in their own ways, they were all incredibly hardworking. And I'm now going to hand back to Shirley to close our proceedings for this evening. I apologise for those people whose questions we didn't get to on this occasion.
Thank you, Ellen. And on behalf of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre, and indeed on behalf of all of us today, I want to extend an enormous thank you to each of you, Rachel, Catherine and Emma, for sharing with us your really fascinating research and experiences, which I think illuminated on one level the advantages and the challenges of growing up with a father of such fame. And on another level also offered enormously vivid portraits of remarkable women in their own rights. As promised, we are going to give away one copy of each of Rachel's and Catherine's books. for the best questions received. And as Alan said, those questions flooded in. We had almost 60 questions, and unfortunately we weren't able to read all of them out, but we did consider all of them for the prizes. And I get the lucky job of announcing the two winners, the first being Ilona Khmeleva from Kiev, Ukraine, for your question on the impact of Churchill's daughters in promoting women's rights. And the second to Eugene McConler for that wonderfully light-hearted question that we just finished with about family nicknames. A reminder that if you would like to buy a copy of Rachel or Catherine's books, please do click on the link that Justin put in the chat. Before we finish, I would like to thank again the International Churchill Society and the Churchill Archive Centre for partnering with us to present this event, and especially again to Alan for doing such a wonderful job as moderator and chair, and also a big thank you to Justin Reish behind the scenes, who has seamlessly managed again the complexities of such a large event. I would like to make a little plug for an event that the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre is holding tomorrow night with Professor Adam Sutcliffe of King's College London, which is titled What Are Jews For? Exploring how Jews and non-Jews alike have thought about the purpose of Jews in the world from biblical times until the present. That's free and is tomorrow night at 7 p.m. UK time. And finally, I want to remind you to please sign up for our next event in the Sir Martin Gilbert Churchill Conversations series, which will be on the subject of Churchill's Europe, where Alan Packwood will be in conversation with Professor Richard Toy and Mr. Felix Klaas about Churchill's view on the European Union and what role he envisaged for Great Britain. Certainly nice and topical. That'll be on Tuesday, the 13th of April at 5 p.m. UK time. And again, we'll have another book giveaway, so it promises to be a wonderful event. Please do register to book your place. And on that note, I will wish you all a good evening, a good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you again for joining us.